Good evening, I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Welcome to Truth Report.
Tonight, we're investigating 3 stories that reveal a disturbing pattern: corporate power exploiting technology, workers, and sovereignty itself for profit. From deepfake pornography operations generating hundreds of thousands in revenue, to life-saving safety equipment that shouldn't need to be sold, to mining companies hiring Trump administration insiders to pressure sovereign territory.
These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a system where profit consistently overrides human dignity, worker safety, and democratic self-determination. Let's start with the exploitation that's happening right now, targeting potentially millions of victims.
According to Bellingcat's investigation published in December 2025, investigative journalists have identified Mark Grayzone, a Hungarian national, as the mastermind behind 2 major deepfake pornography websites, RefacePorn and Deepfake Porn. These sites generated over $331,000 in just 13 months.
Let me put that in context. This is non-consensual sexual imagery. Victims' faces are digitally grafted onto pornographic content without permission, without compensation, and often without their knowledge. This is sexual violence enabled by artificial intelligence, and Mark Grayzone built a business model around it. Between July 2024 and August 2025, his payment processor handled 16,264 transactions.
The scale is staggering. RefacePorn alone received 91,000 visits in October 2025. Deepfake Porn, 154,000 visits in the same month. We're talking about 250,000 site visits in a single month, facilitating the distribution of non-consensual sexual imagery. And Grayzone was careful to hide his tracks.
Extremely careful. He operated through a network of shell companies spanning multiple jurisdictions. Doracron LLP, registered in Canada in March 2022, received the payments. Facitic Ltd in the UK was listed as the domain registrant for RefacePorn. There was also Webnacer Ltd, a dissolved UK company where Grayzone served as sole director going back to 2013. This is sophisticated corporate structuring designed to obscure accountability.
But here's where corporate deception meets digital evidence. Grayzone maintained fake LinkedIn profiles claiming he simultaneously worked as a marketing lead at Google, at dental implant companies, at human resources firms, and at business software companies. All at the same time. These weren't just embellishments, they were fabricated professional identities designed to legitimize his operations.
And that's how Bellingcat caught him. The investigation traced identical Google Analytics tags across RefacePorn, Deepfake Porn, and facitic.com. Digital fingerprints that definitively connected all 3 properties to the same operator. They also found Grayzone listed as registrant for expired domains through WOXI records, and here's the critical error, for reused passwords containing his own name or birth year across personal emails, Doracron accounts, and the RefacePorn support email.
Basic operational security failure that exposed a $300,000 criminal enterprise. But what's particularly disturbing is how he processed payments. He used redirect domains, airmaker.me and remakerai.me, specifically to obscure the sexual nature of transactions from payment processors that restrict adult content. This is deliberate circumvention of payment industry safeguards.
And there were no age verification systems. None. Despite Hungarian law explicitly prohibiting child sexual abuse material, RefacePorn allowed uploads of images without verifying that subjects were adults. We're talking about a platform that could, and likely did, facilitate the creation and distribution of sexually exploitative imagery of minors.
After Bellingcat contacted Grayzone for comment, what happened? He deleted his LinkedIn and X profiles. Both deepfake sites went offline. Internet Archive exclusion requests were filed on December 5, 2025. Facitic Ltd submitted dissolution paperwork on November 10. The entire operation vanished the moment journalists came knocking.
But here's what we need to understand: this wasn't some dark web operation. These were ClearNet websites receiving hundreds of thousands of visits monthly, processing tens of thousands of transactions, generating substantial revenue through mainstream payment processors. The infrastructure enabling this exploitation is corporate, commercial, and operating in plain sight until someone bothers to investigate.
And the victims? They may never know their images were weaponized this way. No notification, no recourse, no compensation. Just their faces, their identities, used to generate profit for Mark Grayzone and his network of shell companies. That's the human cost of unregulated AI technology meeting profit incentive.
Now let's turn to a very different kind of exploitation, one that's perfectly legal but equally revealing about corporate priorities. IEEE Spectrum recently reported on a conductive safety suit for power line workers. It costs between $4,500 and $5,200, and it could save lives. The question we need to ask is, why isn't this standard equipment already?
The suit functions as a Faraday cage, a conductive garment that distributes electrical charge across its surface, protecting workers from dangerous induction currents when they're working on transmission lines carrying 115 kilovolts or more. It includes a strapping system connecting gloves to jacket, ensuring complete electrical continuity. This is proven technology protecting workers from electrocution.
And it's being sold as an optional safety upgrade. Think about that. We have technology that prevents line workers from being electrocuted, and it's positioned in the market as something utilities and contractors can choose to purchase or not. At $5,000 per suit, it's an investment decision, not a mandatory safety standard.
The IEEE Spectrum article, authored by Peter Fairley, who's been covering energy technologies globally for 2 decades, highlights this as an innovation. But the real story is what this innovation reveals about industry standards. If protective equipment this effective exists and isn't universally mandated, that's a policy failure that serves corporate bottom lines at the expense of worker safety.
Let's be explicit about the cost-benefit analysis utilities are making here. $5,000 per suit. Let's say a utility employs 50 line workers who regularly work on high-voltage transmission infrastructure. That's $250,000 for comprehensive protection against electrocution. For context, the average wrongful death settlement in workplace electrocution cases ranges from $1 to $3 million, plus OSHA fines, plus litigation costs, plus reputational damage.
So from a pure financial perspective, setting aside the moral obligation to protect workers, this equipment pays for itself if it prevents a single fatality. And yet adoption isn't universal. That tells us something important: utilities are gambling that accidents won't happen, or that the cost of occasional settlements is acceptable compared to the upfront investment in comprehensive safety equipment.
And who bears the risk of that gamble? The workers. The line workers climbing transmission towers, working with electrical systems that can kill in milliseconds. They're the ones whose safety is being weighed against equipment budgets and quarterly profit margins.
This is a pattern we see across industries. Life-saving technology exists, whether it's construction site fall protection, industrial respirators, or in this case, conductive suits protecting against electrical induction, but it's not mandated until after enough workers die to justify regulatory action. We wait for body counts before we enforce protection.
And here's the corporate calculation: lobbying against safety regulations is cheaper than universal equipment adoption. It's more profitable to fight OSHA standards, to argue that safety measures are burdensome and economically unfeasible, than to simply protect workers as a baseline operational standard.
So we get articles celebrating innovation, which this suit genuinely is, while the underlying scandal goes unreported. The scandal isn't that someone invented a better safety suit. The scandal is that workers are still dying from preventable electrical hazards because comprehensive protection remains optional.
Now let's connect this to our third story, which brings together corporate power, government force, and the complete disregard for democratic sovereignty. According to reporting from the Grayzone, published January 9, 2026, Energy Transition Minerals, an Australian mining company, has hired Ballard Partners, a lobbying firm with deep Trump administration connections, to pressure Greenland over mining rights.
Here are the stakes. Energy Transition Minerals holds a license to explore Greenland's Kvanefjeld deposit, which contains over 11 million metric tons of rare earth minerals, including massive quantities of uranium. This deposit is the world's largest thorium reserve, second largest uranium deposit, and third largest rare earths deposit globally. We're talking about strategic mineral resources worth potentially trillions of dollars.
But in 2021, Greenland's indigenous Atokatijit Party was elected specifically on a platform opposing this mine. Why? Because local communities, sheep farmers, fishermen, indigenous residents, organized against radioactive contamination risks. They used democratic processes to protect their land, their water, their way of life. And Greenland's government, responding to its citizens, banned Energy Transition Minerals operations.
So what did ETM do? They sued. Not in Greenland's courts, but through investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms that allow corporations to challenge sovereign government decisions. They're demanding over $11.5 billion in compensation. Let me repeat that, $11.5 billion. That's more than 4 times Greenland's entire GDP.
This is a lawsuit designed to economically destroy a territory for exercising democratic self-determination. It's not about compensation for actual losses. ETM held an exploration license, not a producing mine. They hadn't extracted billions worth of minerals. This is a punitive measure intended to force Greenland to reverse its mining ban or face economic catastrophe.
And here's where Trump administration connections become relevant. ETM hired Ballard Partners, founded by Brian Ballard, a major Trump donor and fundraiser. Current Attorney General Pam Bondi. She came straight out of Ballard Partners before joining the administration. So did Trump's chief of staff Susie Wiles. Both were hired directly from this lobbying firm.
Bondi signed an ethics agreement preventing her from participating in matters involving Ballard Partners clients. That agreement expires in early February 2026. We're now in mid-January. So within weeks, the U.S. Attorney General, who came directly from the firm now representing ETM, will be legally free to involve herself in matters affecting Greenland and this mining dispute.
And what's the Trump administration's position on Greenland? According to the Grayzone's reporting, the White House has announced it's exploring all options including military invasion to control Greenland. These aren't vague threats. These are explicit statements about using military force against a Danish territory because it won't let an Australian mining company extract radioactive minerals against the will of indigenous communities.
Let's map the power structure here. An Australian corporation wants access to strategic minerals in Greenland. Indigenous communities organize democratically to prevent radioactive contamination. Greenland's elected government responds to its citizens and bans the mine. The corporation sues for 4 times Greenland's GDP. The corporation then hires a lobbying firm that directly staffed the current U.S. administration. And simultaneously, the U.S. government threatens military action to seize control of the territory.
This is corporate power using state military force as a collections agency. Energy Transition Minerals isn't just hiring lobbyists for access, they're hiring the firm that placed people in the Attorney General's office and the Chief of Staff position. The implication is unmistakable: resolve this mining dispute in our favor, or the United States military becomes involved.
And for what? Rare earth minerals and uranium. Strategic resources, certainly, but this isn't about national security. If it were, the U.S. would be investing in domestic rare earth processing or supporting allied production. Instead, we're seeing a foreign corporation leverage U.S. government threats to override indigenous democratic opposition to a radioactive mine.
The Grayzone reporting characterizes this as corporate and state interests aligning to override indigenous democratic decisions through corporate lawsuit mechanisms and military threats. That's not hyperbole. That's a factual description of the sequence of events. ETM loses democratic battle in Greenland. ETM sues for economically devastating damages. ETM hires Trump insiders. Trump administration threatens invasion.
And this isn't even subtle. The lobbying hire and the military threats are happening simultaneously. There's no attempt to hide the connection between corporate interests and government policy. It's openly transactional. A mining company pays for access to people who staff the government, and the government considers military options that serve the mining company's interests.
Now, let's step back and look at what connects these 3 stories, because there's a pattern here that goes beyond individual cases of exploitation or corruption. In each story, we see technology or power being weaponized for profit against people who cannot adequately defend themselves.
Start with the deepfake operation. Mark Grayzone used AI technology to generate non-consensual sexual imagery, built corporate structures across multiple jurisdictions to hide his identity, and exploited payment processing systems to generate hundreds of thousands of dollars. The victims, overwhelmingly women, had no meaningful recourse. No way to know their images were being used, no legal framework to quickly shut down the operation, no compensation mechanism.
The power imbalance is total. Grayzone had technological capability, corporate anonymity, and payment infrastructure. Victims had nothing until journalists at Bellingcat invested substantial resources into investigation. And even then, the resolution was Grayzone deleting his sites and dissolving his companies. No prosecution mentioned, no victim compensation, just disappearance into the next jurisdiction or the next corporate structure.
Now look at the safety suit story. Here we have technology that saves lives, but workers don't have the power to demand it. The utility companies decide whether to invest in $5,000 suits. Workers can't collectively bargain effectively because of decades of anti-union policy. OSHA can't mandate standards without political will to enforce them. So workers climb transmission towers without Faraday cage protection because corporations have more power to resist safety standards than workers have to demand them.
And the Greenland situation is perhaps the clearest example. Indigenous communities used every legitimate tool of democratic self-determination. They organized, they voted, they elected a government that represented their interests, and that government banned a radioactive mine. They did everything right according to the rules of democratic governance.
And they're being punished for it. Sued for 4 times their GDP. Threatened with military invasion. Because corporate power, backed by U.S. government force, trumps democratic sovereignty when strategic resources are involved. The indigenous communities, the Greenlandic people, they have no leverage against a corporation that can hire the lobbying firm that staffed the Trump administration.
So here's the pattern: technological capability combined with corporate power consistently defeats individual rights, worker safety, and even democratic sovereignty. In the deepfake case, AI plus corporate anonymity defeats consent and dignity. In the safety equipment case, market power defeats worker protection. In the Greenland case, corporate lobbying plus military threats defeat indigenous self-determination.
And in each case, the victims are expected to accept the outcome as inevitable. Women whose images are exploited should just accept that technology enables this now. Workers should accept that comprehensive safety equipment is an optional expense. Indigenous communities should accept that their democratic decisions can be overridden when valuable minerals are involved.
But here's what we need to understand: none of this is inevitable. These are policy choices. Mark Grayzone's operation thrived because payment processors don't rigorously verify merchant activity, because international corporate registration allows anonymity, because AI tools are unregulated. Those are policy choices.
The safety suit isn't standard equipment because OSHA standards are weakened by industry lobbying, because union power has been systematically dismantled, Because we've accepted the premise that worker safety must be balanced against corporate profitability. Those are policy choices.
Energy Transition Minerals can sue Greenland for billions because we've created investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms that allow corporations to challenge sovereign democratic decisions. Because we've allowed lobbying firms to staff government positions. Because we've normalized the idea that U.S. military force should be available to advance corporate resource extraction. Those are policy choices.
And every one of those choices can be reversed. We could require meaningful verification for payment processors handling adult content. We could pierce corporate veils that enable criminal operations. We could mandate AI systems maintain consent records. Those are policy options.
We could make Faraday cage suits mandatory for all high-voltage line work. We could strengthen OSHA enforcement. We could empower workers to collectively bargain for safety standards. We could prosecute corporate executives whose cost-cutting decisions result in preventable worker deaths. Those are policy options.
We could abolish investor-state dispute mechanisms that allow corporations to sue countries. We could bar government officials from working on matters involving their former employers for meaningful periods, not 90 days, but years. We could establish as principle that U.S. military force will never be used to advance private corporate interests. Those are policy options.
But those policies won't materialize spontaneously. They require political will, which requires public awareness, which requires journalism that connects the dots. That's why we're not covering these as three separate stories. They're the same story. Corporate power exploiting every available advantage against people with less power.
And the only counter to concentrated corporate power is organized collective action. That means workers forming unions to demand safety equipment. That means communities organizing to reject exploitative resource extraction. That means citizens demanding that government serve public interest rather than corporate lobbying clients.
It also means supporting investigative journalism. Bellingcat exposed Mark Grayzone because they invested resources in digital forensics and international corporate investigation. The Grayzone connected the Greenland mining lobbying to Trump administration threats because they tracked the revolving door between corporate interests and government positions. IEEE Spectrum highlighted the safety suit because they understand the technology even if they didn't emphasize the policy scandal.
We need to fund, share, and protect this kind of journalism. Because corporate exploitation relies on opacity. Shell companies across jurisdictions. Technical complexity that obscures accountability. Lobbying relationships that aren't disclosed. When journalists illuminate those connections, corporate power loses its primary advantage.
So here's what we're asking from you. First, recognize the pattern. When you see new technology being used to exploit people, when you see workers dying from preventable hazards, when you see sovereign communities being overridden by corporate pressure, understand that these aren't isolated problems. They're symptoms of a system designed to concentrate power and profit.
Second, reject inevitability. We're told that deepfakes are just part of the internet now, that comprehensive safety equipment is too expensive, that strategic resources require military backing for corporate extraction. None of that is true. Those are choices, and they can be different choices.
Third, support the organizations fighting back. That's investigative journalism exposing corporate crime. That's unions demanding worker safety. That's indigenous communities resisting resource extraction. That's advocacy organizations pushing for policy reform. Find them, fund them, amplify them.
And finally, demand accountability from the officials who claim to represent you. Ask your representatives whether they support mandatory AI consent frameworks. Ask whether they'll vote to strengthen OSHA enforcement. Ask whether they believe U.S. military force should be available to mining companies threatening indigenous communities. Make them answer and vote accordingly.
Because the alternative is what we've documented tonight. A system where Mark Grayzone generates $300,000 from non-consensual sexual imagery. Where line workers risk electrocution because Faraday suits are optional expenses. Where Greenlandic democracy can be threatened with invasion because an Australian mining company hired the right lobbyists.
That's not a sustainable system. It's not a just system. And it's definitely not the inevitable system. It's the system we've allowed to be built through decades of policy choices favoring corporate power over human dignity, profit over safety, extraction over sovereignty.
We can build different systems. We can regulate AI to require consent. We can mandate safety equipment. We can abolish the mechanisms that let corporations sue countries. We can bar the revolving door between lobbying and government. We can establish that military force serves public interest, not private profit.
But only if we recognize the pattern, reject the inevitability, and organize to demand better. That's the work. That's always been the work.
I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Thanks for watching Truth Report. Stay informed, stay critical, and keep demanding accountability.
Good night.